I got into a great conversation with a listener of the show earlier about taxes. Now, I know that sounds incredibly boring, but hear me out and you'll see why at least I think it's not boring at all. And the conversation was basically, well, what's the proper tax rate? Okay, what should people be taxed and why should they be taxed at that amount? And how is it different in the United States of America versus in Britain or versus just in Europe in general? And during the course of this conversation, a couple things occurred to me. First of all, very few people in America have even the slightest clue about the nuance and complexity of tax law. And then the second thing is they should. They should know about those things, because how can you make educated decisions on who to vote for or what policy makes sense if you're incredibly ignorant about a big issue like taxes? So I got to thinking, well, what do I view as an ideal tax rate? And my conclusion is this: it depends. That seems terribly unsatisfying, doesn't it? Well, actually, let me give you a little more information and let me rile up both my progressive listeners and my conservative listeners. So, to all my progressive listeners, you know what? I'm in favor of a 0% tax rate. Never thought you'd hear me say that, would you? And now let me flip it. To all my conservative listeners, or I'm sorry, all my conservative listeners, sorry, I'm in favor of a 100% tax rate. How does that make any sense, and isn't that wildly contradictory? Well, no, because there's only roughly 14,976 different kinds of taxes, and some of them should exist, some of them shouldn't exist, some of them should be a high rate, some of them should be a low rate, some of them should be no rate at all. So first of all, think about it like this, man. Do you know the difference between a marginal tax rate and a regular tax rate? Well, a regular income tax is a tax on your income, right? And it could be 20% or 15% or 25%, and that's the amount of money that the federal government will take when you make money, right? But when it comes to a marginal income tax rate, that's not the same as just an income tax rate. So whenever you hear people bring up the fact that in the United States during the golden age of economic expansion, so roughly from the late 1940s until the 1970s, we had a top marginal rate of anywhere between 70% and 93%. They're not saying that the government came in to rich people and said, all right, I'm going to take 93% of your money. Thank you. Because that would be fucking insane, and nobody would be in favor of that. What they are saying is a marginal tax rate. So what that means is your first X amount of money, whether it's $1 million or $3 million or $5 million, or in some cases it goes as high as 10 or 20 million, that amount of money is taxed at the lower rate. That may be 30% or 35%. And then everything you make above that number, so let's just say for argument's sake it's $5 million, okay? Everything above the $5 million that you make is then taxed at 93%. And even then it's not a full 93% because that's the nominal rate, which just means on paper, and you need to put in your deductions, and then your effective rate when all is said and done in that time span during the golden age of economic expansion was 43%. So we had a top marginal rate of 43%. Okay, and look, the whole idea of having a marginal rate and then also a regular income tax rate and then other forms of taxes like the capital gains tax, which is a tax on investment, is you have to try to find a way to fund the government to do all the things that we all need government to do, right? And you need to do it in a fair way. And you need to do it in a progressive manner in the sense that you have the rich people carrying more of the burden because they can afford to do it. Whereas if you tax somebody who makes $20,000 a year at 30%, they can't fucking afford that. They don't make enough money as it is. So when I say I'm in favor of a 0% tax rate and a 100% tax rate, here's what I mean. If you make $20,000, you shouldn't pay anything in taxes. A lot of conservatives would disagree with that, which is funny because that shows that conservatives are actually in favor of higher taxes than I am in many respects. Here's what I like. I like low taxes to no taxes on the poor, on low-income workers, okay? On the middle class, I like very low taxes. I've never seen a middle-class tax cut I didn't support. You know, if you make... Look, I'm I'm one of those guys who says if you make, $75,000 or less, maybe even $100,000 or less, you should pay very little taxes. Okay, and look, that's a good amount of money, right? But still, you're making enough money in that scenario where you are well off, but it's not like, Mitt Romney / Donald Trump / Paris Hilton or super wealthy Koch brother money or anything like that. You're a working person who did well. And I don't want to punish you via the tax system. When we get up in the $250,000 range, that's where I say, okay, now we can kick it up a little bit. Now you can pay a little more in taxes. Now, when we get all the way up to the 100% tax. Well, Kyle, don't be crazy, right? I mean, how can anybody be in favor of 100% tax? Well, if you make $1.3 billion a year, by the way, as some people do, we've covered the stories on this show, the exorbitant wealth over the top, whether it's the Koch brothers or other billionaires, right? Yeah, I think it's a totally reasonable position to say, I am in favor of a 100% effective marginal tax rate for everything you make over $1 billion. Tom Hartman has brought this up before. Okay, Tom Hartman has said, yeah, why not just make a, top out at $1 billion clause? And look, that doesn't mean that it's always going to be $1 billion, so that in 570 years, when $1 billion is not worth $1 billion anymore, $1 billion because of inflation becomes like 5 million or whatever. No, what you do is you say 100% marginal tax for everything you make over $1 billion. Okay, and chain that to inflation. So let's say 500 years down the road, what is today's $1 billion is like, I don't know, 60 billion. Well, then okay, that marginal number rose because you chained it to inflation, right? So that's the point, man. The tax system should be nuanced. It should be complex. And it should allow for some people paying no taxes because they don't make enough money to afford taxes. And it should, in some cases, say, yeah, everything over that amount of money, sorry, we're going to tax you at 100%. Does anybody really think you can't survive on $1 billion a year? Like there's some sort of oppression going on against the people who make over $1 billion a year. You're an idiot if you think that. You're just an idiot. I don't even want to have a conversation with you. We live in a world where the richest 85 people make more money and have more wealth than the bottom 3.5 billion. 85 people, which you can fit on a double-decker bus. They make more money, they have more wealth than 50% of the world. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. That's fucking stupid. So what you need to do is set up public policy and set up governments around the world where, yes, you do redistribution of wealth, because that's not a dirty word. That shouldn't be a dirty word. It makes sense in many scenarios. Okay, so people should have the right to health care. People should have the right to education. We should have basic marketplace regulation like an FDA to make sure you don't eat salmonella and die because there's no cop on the beat to make sure that a greedy food company isn't poisoning you to get a little richer. We need to have roads and bridges and some jobs provided by the government. There are many areas where the private sector has shown themselves to be too greedy to handle it, and you need a nonprofit government entity to take care of it. That's why you need to have a progressive tax system to fund the government so that they can function. Look, I'm one of those people who looks at the social democracies of Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, and I say, yeah, let's copy that because that's what works empirically. They have the happiest people in the world, okay, according to them and according to the UN. They've done studies into this, and they self-report being the happiest. They have the best healthcare systems in the world. They have the best middle classes per capita. And the list goes on, and best education systems. In every area you can imagine, they're kicking everybody's ass in the world. Now, maybe we should learn a thing or two from that. And what do they prove, among many things? That a very progressive tax system works. If you're middle class or poor, you should pay little to no taxes. And if you're super rich, you should pay a lot of taxes.